Terraria Calamity Mod has recently released a new mini update. The mini update added several new cool weapons and cute Roombas, but it has also reworked tons of existing weapons into something more insane and cool. Let's first start with Heavenly Gale. The old version of this bow used to be really bad. Nobody really bothered to craft it as it was slow to use, did not have any homing capabilities, and unappealing. But the new Heavenly Gale looks heavenly, fitting of its name. With the new lightning effects and homing properties, I feel like it has finally gotten the rework it has long deserved. Although do keep in mind that it takes time for the lightning to recharge, so you might not want to spam use the bow as the lightning deals really insane damage. As some of you might know, Heavenly Gale is known as the famous Calamity endgame bow that is crafted using the most of the essential bows you have used on your Calamity Ranger playthrough, aka the zenith of the bows. And since it's an endgame weapon, it is insanely powerful as it's only craftable after defeating the final bosses of the game. And yes, as to be expected from the Calamity zenith of the bows, it is quite expensive and time consuming to craft. Do not get fooled by the 6 bows appearing on the crafting recipe page, as some of these bows combine use 17 other bows to craft, resulting in around more than 23 bows in total just to craft this one bow. That is just insanity. Hence why not much people bother to craft the old Heavenly Gale. But with a new rework, is it now worth it to craft this weapon? I'd say very much yes. It now looks amazing, and I have found that with the perfect aiming angle, the lightning from the bow can obliterate bosses really easily, especially worm bosses like Devourer of Gods if it hits many sections of its body. So instead of spam using the weapon, try to do short charge bursts with calculated angles using this bow, and I can guarantee in most scenarios it will most likely be more powerful. Look, I know it's an endgame weapon, but I have to say the classic joke. It is perfectly balanced. The next weapon is the Subsuming Vortex. Believe it or not, but this weapon has now received its recent third major change. It used to be a support mage weapon as only a few vortexes can appear at a time, but now finally it has become a full-on DPS mage weapon, and I honestly prefer this version much more. The new Subsuming Vortex has 2 modes of firing, the first one being shooting barrages of vortex that races towards enemies, and the second one charging a gigantic vortex in front of you. Then it sends small vortex to enemies nearby, and when it's big enough you can release it for a big boom. It is very satisfying to use this weapon. The sound effects are just amazing to hear, and the visual effects are so good. Goodbye Dance of Light, Subsuming Vortex is now my #1 favorite mage weapon. And yes, this weapon is indeed also an endgame weapon that can only be crafted after the final bosses are defeated, similar to the before mentioned Heavenly Gale. It uses quite many spell tomes or magic books, whatever you want to call it, as its crafting material. It is basically the zenith of the magic spell tomes. And yes, since it is an endgame weapon, it is very powerful, but it very much deserves to be this powerful. And besides, you as a player deserve to feel this powerful because you have basically finished the game. But damn, this weapon feels so satisfying and fun to use, especially exploding and one-shotting enemies with its big bang. I think Calamity is really loving the summoner class this update with all the new summoner stuffs being added and reworked, as the rest of the next weapons belong in the summoner class. But before I continue, I do have to thank Murasama1 for making a video on this weapon rework so early so I can get caught up with the update. Starting first with the Cosmilamp. Back then, the lanterns used to be the ones that attack the enemies, but now the lanterns stay still and shoot homing cosmic bolts. It is pretty cool how the visual effects make the bolts appear dancing. A bit of an introduction, Cosmilamp is a summoner weapon dropped by Cygnus, one of the Devourer of Gods Sentinel. So it is very easy to obtain as it doesn't require any crafting. This weapon has always been my go-to choice as my secondary weapon against the Devourer of Gods. I'd hate to admit it, but way too often as my free damage slot when I'm using other classes aside from Summoner. But Git, it requires 2 minion slots. That is why I always keep a summoning potion ready in my inventory. So yeah, as a Cosmilamp enjoyer, I am glad it got the rework and visual change it desperately needed. From boring poking minions to pew pew laser but very cool laser. Next weapon is the Infected Remote, a summoner weapon dropped by the Plaguebringer Goliath. Comparing to the old version of it, if you notice, the moveset is pretty much similar, but indeed the new one looks better and acts smoother. She cycles between 3 attack patterns, dashing at enemies, shooting trailing homing rockets, and summoning mini Plaguebringers. Her name is codenamed Virid, and she requires 3 minion slots to summon. I'd say this weapon performs better as a secondary support weapon due to the plague debuff she inflicts that melts enemies. As far as I remember, I don't think the Moon Lord is immune to the plague debuff, so Virid can be up for a good match against the God of the Moon. And I can already see some Rule 34 artists making lewd art of her, which might not be a good thing, but might be a good thing, I do not know. Next weapon is the Virid Vanguard, yet again another summoner weapon. The old Virid Vanguard used to be awkward to use. It heavily crowds your screen, making you unable to see shit, and just feels slow and weird to use. But the new Virid Vanguard feels faster to use, tidier, cleaner, and no longer awkward to use. It alternates between sweeping back and forth and teleporting on top of its target and falling. Each blade performs up to 7 attacks before changing its behavior. Interestingly, it is now an upgrade to the vanilla Terra Prisma summoner weapon. Very cool. It performs very well as a post-providence weapon due to the Wily Bloom it requires, and as an upgrade to Terra Prisma, it performs excellent. 10 out of 10. I would recommend you guys to use this weapon to face post-providence bosses like Poltergust and the Devourer Sentinels. And let's not talk about the sound effects, because those are very satisfying to hear, and those slice and dice moveset makes killing enemies very fun. Definitely one of the best rewards out there in Calamity in my opinion. Considering how bad and awkward it used to be, nobody really used this weapon before, but I can almost 100% guarantee now people are lining up to use the new Virid Vanguard. Huge Calamity W. And the last but not least in our list, the Rusty Beacon Prototype, a pre-hard mode summoner sentry. The old RBP used to be a joke. It is almost unusable, despite being a cool concept. It finally got a change, a rework it desperately needed. Now the Summon Drone Sentry releases toxic waves that inflict sulfuric poisoning debuff. Despite being a tiny sentry, it is comically powerful. And I'm saying this without even a slight exaggeration. Do not get fooled by the 2 damage on this weapon's description, because what's truly powerful is the debuff this weapon inflicts. The sulfuric poisoning debuff, a debuff that can literally only be inflicted by hard mode weapons and enemies. And what's even funnier is this weapon can be obtained very early, as it can be found in the Rusty chest in the Sulfurous Sea biome. The debuff it inflicts melts flesh-based enemies, which explains why it performs not so good on enemies like Skeleton, as they are immune to it, but insanely well on zombies. 2 channels called Kurayo and Biliaf did a great job explaining it. It is good on flesh-based bosses like Eye of Tuluhu. It melts this huge heaping flesh of an eye very fast. And you know what else is flesh? The brain of Tuluhu. The fact that this weapon melts the brain in under than 15 seconds is just truly phenomenal. It is comically funny how broken this weapon is. Don't forget that the wall of flesh is basically a huge wall of flesh, which means this weapon is very good against it, considering how early you get this weapon. It's like the devs balanced the weapon damage perfectly but completely forgot to balance the debuff it inflicts. The best part? This weapon is a sentry weapon, so you can still use your summoner weapon minions to its max potential. If you did not know, sentry weapons have its own dedicated slot, meaning it doesn't take your summoner minion slots. And since it only takes 1 sentry slot, you can use this weapon even if you're not using summoner class, like the melee class for example. And the damage doesn't matter because what we care about is the debuff it inflicts, which means this weapon literally gives you free huge damage without any consequences. This fact alone brings this weapon very high in weapon power ranking tier list, and probably deserves the title of the deadliest pre-hard mode support weapon. I find it funny that this pre-boss weapon can still help you even in hard mode, since there are many enemies that are not immune to this debuff. It deserves a video on its own, but I don't know how fast the devs are able to nerf it, so enjoy this powerhouse of a weapon while you still can. But we can all agree on one thing. The newly reworked Rusty Beacon prototype is perfectly balanced.